Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When I first moved into the cul-de-sac, the street was so quiet you could hear the wind push through the trees like a whisper from one end to the other, and that was the exact reason I bought the house. I had just turned 44, was finally divorced, child-free by choice, and had saved up enough to buy something peaceful where I could work from home without distraction, grill my meals without side eyes from anyone, and sleep without wondering if I'd get woken up by anything other than birds or maybe the occasional thunderstorm. It was the kind of place where people waved from across the street without expecting a conversation, where neighbors kept to themselves, and no one's dog barked past sundown. Then the Smithsons moved in. At first, I didn't panic, even though they showed up with 3 trucks, 2 motorcycles, and what I'm pretty sure was a DJ booth. It's a free country, right? People are allowed to be loud on moving day. I smiled, introduced myself, brought over a basket of muffins like some kind of stereotype out of a small-town welcome committee, and told them if they needed anything, I was right next door. They were polite enough. A little distracted, a lot sweaty. Mark, the husband, wore cargo shorts and a Bluetooth headset the entire time. Carrie, the wife, seemed pleasant but exhausted, clearly wrangling their twin teens who were already arguing over who got which bedroom. That was the last time I heard the Smithsons speak in anything less than a shout. It started small, one backyard gathering on a Saturday night. Fine, okay, it's summer. People grill, have a few beers, let loose. But then it was Sunday, then the following Friday, then Tuesday, and soon enough there wasn't a single week without a little get-together, turning into a full-blown event. They had a pool installed. Then came the speakers mounted on the patio, the laser lights for evening ambience, and what I can only describe as a karaoke machine powerful enough to be heard 3 houses away. It was like living next to a wedding reception that never actually ended. I tried. Believe me, I really did try to be reasonable. I didn't want to be the cranky neighbor or the miserable middle-aged lady who can't stand joy. I went over during a lull and very politely, almost painfully politely, asked if they could turn it down just a bit after 10. They smiled that kind of smile that makes your teeth hurt, nodded a few times, and said something vague about keeping it cool and just blowing off steam. That night, the music went until 1:30 in the morning, and someone sang Sweet Caroline so badly I genuinely feared they might be choking. I waited a few weeks. Then I asked again. Same smile, same nod, same nothing. It wasn't just the noise. It was the trash left on the curb for days, the guests who parked on my grass, the dog that barked every time it heard a leaf fall, and the way Mark started revving that ridiculous motorcycle at 7:30 in the morning before I'd even finished my coffee. Still, I tried not to escalate. I didn't want to call the police over what boiled down to people being inconsiderate. I didn't want a neighborhood war. I just wanted to sleep. And then came the tipping point. It was mid-June. The Smithsons were throwing what they called their summer banger, which I only knew because a flyer had mysteriously ended up on my windshield. I had already accepted that I wasn't going to get anything done that day, so I sat on my back porch with headphones on, noise-canceling ones I had paid nearly $400 for, trying to read a book and ignore the bass thumping through my skull. Eventually, I took off the headphones to grab another drink, and that's when I heard it. She's just sensitive, someone said, followed by a burst of laughter. I paused, eyes narrowed, still holding my glass halfway in the air. Then another voice chimed in, louder, laughing harder. She just hates fun. You can't fix that kind of miserable. That's when it hit me. Not just the insult, not just the lack of respect, but the assumption. The assumption that I was the problem. That asking for a little quiet made me broken or bitter or some sort of joyless hag. They weren't just ignoring me. They were mocking me. Writing me off as a joke for daring to want peace in the house I worked my ass off to buy. I didn't say a word. I didn't storm over. I didn't throw the drink or shout across the fence. I just turned around, walked inside, and sat down at my desk. My laptop was already open. I clicked the browser, typed in the address I knew by heart because I'd been checking it every few weeks, the house on the other side of the Smithsons. The one that had been on the market for months because the layout was weird and the kitchen was dated and the backyard had no shade. Still listed. Still available. The price had dropped by nearly $20,000 since last month. I stared at it for a long moment, then reached for my wine, took a long, slow sip, and felt something shift inside me. Not rage. Not even spite. Just clarity. I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. It's one thing to daydream about revenge while sipping lukewarm wine at midnight, fuming in your pajamas with Zillow open on one monitor and your dignity draining slowly into the carpet. It's another thing entirely to act on it. I didn't expect to go through with it, not at first. I figured I'd bookmark the listing, maybe check it once a week while muttering idle threats to the Smithsons under my breath like a tired sitcom villain. But the morning after their little, sensitive jab, I found myself calling the realtor without even thinking about it. Her name was Linda. She was chipper, probably mid-50s, and used words like opportunity and versatile floor plan and motivated seller, like she'd been practicing them in front of a mirror for decades. I toured the place the next day. It was, by most people's standards, a fixer-upper in denial. The kitchen tiles were cracked, the carpet in the guest bedroom smelled like a hamster had died under it, and the backyard had a weird cement patch that looked like the foundation for an above-ground pool someone gave up on. But I didn't care. I wasn't looking for charm. I was looking for potential, specifically, the kind of potential that makes your neighbors think twice before mocking you again. With some creative accounting and a modest loan, I closed on the house 2 weeks later. Price tag? $370,000. Give or take the kind of fees they always tack on like garnish you never asked for. I dipped into savings I'd originally set aside for a vacation to Portugal, and instead, I bought spite square footage. I wasn't mad about it. Now, let me be clear, I didn't plan to move in. I had no interest in flipping it either. This wasn't about property value. This was about sending a message. I created a spreadsheet, labeled it Phase 2, and began the most delicious research of my adult life. I combed through listings, Reddit forums, Facebook groups, and even Craigslist ads, looking for one very specific type of tenant, someone who loved noise. Not just tolerated it, lived in it, breathed it, created it like an artist on the edge of genius and madness. That's how I found Jake. Jake was 32, single, clean background check, no pets, and most importantly, a professional drum instructor. His email read like a symphony of chaos. He had glowing reviews from his students and angry notes from former landlords who used phrases like, shook the drywall, and impossible to negotiate with. He was looking for a standalone property to rent, where sound wouldn't be an issue, and mentioned that he taught both individual lessons and small group sessions. Bingo. We met for coffee. He wore cargo pants and a Metallica hoodie, had one of those beards that looked like it had been trimmed with drumsticks, and he was charming in that barely contained energy kind of way, like he was constantly tapping rhythms in his head. When I told him the house was available immediately and I didn't mind his hobby, he actually leaned across the table and asked if I was joking. I told him I wasn't. I said I supported the arts. Which was true. In a way. Jake moved in the following weekend with 3 full drum kits, a collection of speakers, a portable sound mixer, and 2 floor fans for acoustic balance. He practiced religiously. About 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is roughly 55 hours a week, give or take a break for beer or burritos. I waited. It took less than 48 hours for the Smithsons to crack. First it was the subtle glances. Carrie walking out to get the mail with that tight-lipped, forced smile that said she wanted to talk but didn't know how to start. Mark peering through the fence like a man waiting for a raccoon to steal his grill. Then came the inevitable knock. It was a Tuesday. Late afternoon. I had just finished watering my tomatoes and was wearing my favorite introverts against small talk hoodie when I heard the knock on the front door. I opened it and there stood Carrie Smithson, makeup done but a little smudged, like she'd been crying or yelling or both. Her smile was so tight it looked stapled in place. "Hi there," she chirped, voice 1 decibel too high. "Hope I'm not bothering you." I tilted my head and smiled back. Not at all. She glanced across the street, where Jake's garage was open, the sound of a double bass pedal thundering like a distant cavalry charge. So, your new tenant. Is he, in a band or something? I held her gaze for a moment, just long enough to enjoy the shift in her eyes, that flicker of confusion and dread. Nope, I said. He's just really passionate about his work. She blinked. Work? He's a drum instructor, I said sweetly. Practices a lot. Teaches sometimes, too. But you know how it is, creative types. They need space to express themselves. Her face twitched. Right. We stood there in silence for a few more seconds, the thunder of snares rolling through the air like a war cry. Well, she finally muttered, just wanted to say hello. Welcome him to the neighborhood. That's kind of you, I said. I'm sure he'll appreciate it. She turned and walked back down the path, the soles of her sandals slapping the concrete in rapid succession. I closed the door, leaned against it, and let myself smile, the kind of smile that only comes once you've finally been heard loud and clear. I have to admit, I didn't expect Jake to be quite so thorough. I assumed he'd play for a few hours a day, maybe host the occasional lesson or jam session, enough to send a message and rattle a few windows, but still live like a semi-normal person. I was wrong. Delightfully, thunderously wrong. Within days of moving in, Jake had transformed the outdated, echoey living room into something that looked like a soundproofed war zone. Drum kits in 2 corners, various snares and cymbals arranged like tactical gear. Microphones dangling from the ceiling like mechanical spiders, and floor padding I'm pretty sure he bought in bulk from some abandoned gymnastics studio. He didn't ease into the noise, either. The first Monday after move-in, I woke up at 7:02 a.m. to the distant rumble of a double bass drum line so powerful I could feel it in my teeth. It was like living next to a military drill team rehearsing for Judgment Day. By the time I was pouring my coffee, he'd transitioned into syncopated snare rhythms, tight and fast and unapologetic, and from where I stood at the window, I could see Mark Smithson through his kitchen blinds, rubbing his temples like someone being haunted by the ghost of a marching band. That entire week was a masterclass in auditory warfare. Jake played everything from jazz fills to death metal blasts, Latin timbals to military cadence rolls, and he didn't stop for anyone. He'd take short breaks to stretch or step outside for air, but then he was right back in the seat, sticks in hand, smile on his face, thundering joy into the neighborhood like a caffeinated metronome. The first sign that things were unraveling across the property line came that Friday, when I saw the Smithsons' teenage daughter storm out of the house, throw a duffel bag into her boyfriend's car, and yell something about not listening to that stupid drum guy for one more minute. The car peeled off and didn't return until the following afternoon. I pretended not to notice, even as Carrie stood on the porch in her robe, mouthing something I didn't quite catch but assumed was probably not a holiday greeting. By the next week, Mark was outside pacing the front lawn at least twice a day, phone in one hand, cigarette in the other, yelling into the receiver like a man slowly losing a custody battle with his own sanity. I caught a few key phrases. I can't even hear myself think. This is harassment. The HOA won't do anything. And once, my personal favorite, I don't care if he's teaching Beethoven, he's teaching it too damn loud. Every morning I made sure to step out at just the right moment, usually mid-drum solo, to grab the mail or water my plants or wave at the UPS driver, and each time I caught eyes with the Smithsons, I'd give them the same warm, nonchalant smile. Sometimes I'd add a little, good morning, just for flavor. The first few times, Carrie would return the smile, stiffly, the corners of her mouth pulled like taut wires. Eventually, she stopped trying. Mark didn't even bother pretending. He just glared, red-eyed and visibly vibrating. On the third Sunday, something truly poetic happened. I was taking out the trash when Mark approached the sidewalk, still in pajama pants, hair wild, eyes bloodshot like he hadn't slept in a week. He looked at me, long and hard, then said, "You hear that, right? That pounding?" I blinked innocently. "Oh, you mean Jake?" He nodded, waiting for sympathy. I took a breath, tilted my head, and said, some people are just a little sensitive. Then I walked back to my porch and left him standing there with his jaw half open and his hands twitching like he wanted to throw something but hadn't decided what yet. And the best part? It wasn't over. Because Jake wasn't just a practicing drummer, he was also an instructor. A popular one at that. After 2 weeks in the neighborhood, he came by one afternoon with an extra-large iced coffee and a grin like a teenager with a secret. He'd picked up a new gig, he said, with a local community group looking to run drumline classes for beginners. They didn't have a space yet, and he mentioned the garage was big enough. Was I okay with him teaching a few students from home? 2 afternoons a week. Maybe 6 or 7 kids. Just for a couple hours after school. I looked at him, nodded once, and said, "Jake, that sounds like the perfect fit." He beamed, told me I was the coolest landlord he'd ever had, and wandered off to tune his toms. That night, I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the Smithsons haul their garbage cans to the curb while Jake's drums echoed through the early dusk like a thunderstorm building over the horizon. Every Tuesday and Thursday would now be soundtracked by beginner-level percussionists, pounding out sloppy rhythms and high-energy snare rolls, laughing, shouting, learning. And I smiled into my mug, because it was only getting started. By the time Jake's Tuesday and Thursday drumline classes were in full swing, you could practically feel the neighborhood splitting down invisible lines like fault zones. There were the people who saw it for what it was, an organized, harmless after-school hobby, and there were the people who saw it as the latest front in an increasingly absurd suburban war. And sitting right in the eye of that storm, arms crossed and seething behind her embroidered throw pillows, was Carrie Smithson, who was growing more frantic by the day. She tried subtlety first, and it was almost cute, like watching someone read the first half of a war manual and then forget where they put the rest. There was a new sign on her lawn that read, "Respect your neighbors, keep it down," staked firmly into the grass like some moral high ground could be built out of plastic letters. She suddenly started waving at me again in that overly gracious, brittle way that made it clear she was hoping I'd feel guilt instead of glee. But I didn't wave back. I just nodded once, polite and noncommittal, like a monarch being acknowledged by a jester. Mark wasn't handling it much better. He'd begun spending most evenings pacing outside with his phone held flat in front of him, recording long stretches of Jake's lessons like he was building a legal case or trying to capture audio for a paranormal investigation. I once saw him holding a decibel meter he must have ordered online, standing on the edge of his property line like a man preparing to sue the wind. The irony, of course, was delicious, because this was the same man who used to crank his Bluetooth speaker past midnight and argue that it's just music when people asked him to turn it down. Then came their masterstroke, if you could call it that, a neighborhood block party that was clearly nothing more than a veiled PR campaign to rebuild their shattered image. Flyers were dropped in every mailbox on the street, inviting us all to an old-fashioned neighborhood mixer with music, food, and games for all ages. There was even a line about coming together in the spirit of unity and respect, which might have carried more weight if it hadn't come from the same people who once hosted a wet t-shirt contest during Labor Day weekend. I went, of course. Not out of curiosity. Out of strategy. 5 people showed up. 5. 2 of them were teenagers lured by the promise of free soda. The other 3 were older neighbors from down the street who had never particularly liked the Smithsons to begin with, but were polite enough to smile and take a paper plate of overcooked hot dogs. The rest of the street? Silent. Windows closed. Porch lights off. Jake, naturally, was home that evening, and the muffled beat of his drums pulsed steadily from his garage the entire time like a heartbeat beneath the silence. You could see it on Carrie's face halfway through, realization blooming slowly into something sour and personal. The party wrapped up an hour early. The rented popcorn machine stayed untouched. The music, low and tasteful for once, never climbed past background noise. I left early too, but not before walking over to Jake's and handing him a slice of leftover birthday cake from my freezer and saying, "You're making quite the impression." He grinned, eyes lighting up like a kid handed a new toy. We stood in the garage for a few minutes, the kind of quiet, easy conversation that comes from people who've both had to explain themselves too many times in life. Turns out, Jake used to be a touring drummer for a regional funk band that almost got famous, played shows across the Midwest, lived in vans and backyards, and crashed on couches until his body told him to quit. He loved teaching now, loved watching people figure out rhythm the same way he once did, awkward, clumsy, but unstoppable once it clicked. Somewhere in the middle of his story, he asked if I'd ever played. I laughed. Not a chance, I said. I hadn't even touched an instrument since high school choir, and I was too old to start now. Jake just shook his head and handed me a pair of sticks like he was offering a secret. Sit down, he said, pointing to the stool. Try something. So I did. Clumsy as hell, arms stiff, legs unsure, I tapped out a rhythm that sounded like a shopping cart rolling over gravel. Jake clapped anyway, and I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the sticks. I looked up, out through the open garage door, and that's when I saw her, Carrie Smithson, standing in her living room window, arms crossed, face like thunder behind the glass. And then, with the slow drama of a soap opera villain, she reached up and slammed the window shut. I didn't stop laughing for a solid minute. That night, I sat in my living room with the windows cracked open, listening to the distant echo of snare rolls and the low hum of a bass drum bouncing gently through the cul-de-sac. Not noise. Not nuisance. Music. Joy. Community. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about rhythm. By the time the seasons started to shift again and the trees along our cul-de-sac began their slow, rusty fade into fall, Jake had managed something I hadn't predicted when this whole orchestration began. He had become an institution. Not just a guy who played loud music or taught a few kids how to slap a snare. No, he was now a fixture, the unofficial rhythm of the neighborhood. It started with a few teenagers, just curious enough to try a lesson or two after school, but it didn't stop there. Word got around quickly that Jake was patient, funny, didn't take himself too seriously, and knew how to make even the most hopeless kid feel like they had timing. Soon, parents started showing up at his door, some tentative and some practically dragging their kids behind them, asking about lesson availability. He had waitlists by Halloween. At one point, I caught him high-fiving a sixth grader after a clean fill and realized we'd gone from noise complaint central to having our very own community program, and it was all happening in a garage that used to be nothing more than drywall and lawn tools. It was bizarre. It was beautiful. And it was loud. Meanwhile, across the property line, the Smithsons' house grew quieter with each passing week. Gone were the late-night karaoke sessions, the raucous weekend cookouts, the endless line of SUVs and beer bottles clinking in coolers. Their porch light stayed off most nights. Their teenage daughter stopped showing up entirely. I hadn't seen Mark mow the lawn since September, and Carrie started walking the dog with her earbuds so deep in her ears. I half expected her to walk into a tree just to avoid eye contact. They never spoke to me again, not directly, not even in passing. Once, I waved just to see what would happen, and Mark looked right through me like I was a tree or a trash can or something lower than both. And honestly, I understood. Because even though I never once told Jake what to do, never once encouraged him to go louder or longer or more often, they knew. They absolutely knew. And that silence between us, it was loaded. Not just with anger, but with acknowledgement. They knew they had underestimated me. They knew I hadn't forgotten the laughs, the whispers, the way they dismissed me like I was some bitter nuisance when all I wanted was a little peace. But the strange thing was, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. Not really. Sure, there had been moments, watching Carrie storm away from her window, seeing Mark pacing like a bear outside while Jake hit a perfect paradiddle inside. But as the days got colder and the leaves began to cover their neglected yard, I started to wonder what it all meant. I had wanted to be heard, to reclaim the peace they had stolen, to prove that I wasn't fragile or unreasonable or weak. And I did. But in that victory, something unexpected had happened. I had changed too. The anger that fueled me in the beginning, it had faded into something quieter, something calmer. I still smiled when Jake played. I still laughed when the kids in his class botched a rhythm and tried to play it off like jazz. But the war, at least for me, was over. I wasn't fighting anymore. Then, in early December, a moving truck appeared in front of the Smithsons' house. No warning, no open house, just a beige truck and a few workers hauling out boxes in quiet, efficient shifts. I watched from my window without blinking, coffee in hand, not cheering, not gloating, just watching. Because it didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure. 3 days later, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No stamp. No return address. Just my name on the front, written in a tight, aggressive script I didn't recognize until I opened it. Inside was a note, only 5 words, but heavy as a stone. Congratulations. You won. Carrie, that was it. No greeting. No signature flourish. No attempt at sarcasm or apology or even anger. Just the flat truth of a grudge sealed and sent by hand. I read it twice, then tucked it into the drawer with my old tax papers and warranties I never use. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just felt done. But the world, it seems, doesn't wait for endings to finish before starting the next chapter. 2 days after the truck drove away, a fresh realtor's sign popped up in the Smithsons' yard. I didn't care what the listing price was or how quickly it would sell. I didn't ask who would move in next. Because by that time, I was already walking a different cul-de-sac, 2 blocks over, smiling politely at the couple arguing in their driveway about whether their music was too much for a Tuesday night. I'd seen the online complaints, "Can't even sleep," one neighbor had written, but no one does anything because it's just music. Sounded familiar. The house next door to them? Still listed. Same floor plan. Same builder. Bit cheaper this time, thanks to the market dip. Turns out I have a real talent for percussion and for property investment.